technology is working like it's supposed to. And I see the little red record light is on. So I'm going to officially welcome everybody again to this first of these Plexus pop-up calls that we're using Zoom to do. And what we had talked about was the notion of hearing people's stories to help us think and understand together about where Plexus has been and where Plexus can now go. And when I was thinking about stories, and I'm going to use very high-tech technology to share ideas and screens with you today, I'm going to hold up a piece of paper. And so the piece of paper says, as you see, once upon a time. And, you know, when we think about how stories start in the stories of our childhood, you know, it's so common for us to think about the stories once upon a time. And of course, in terms of time, those stories talk about and focus on maybe where we were, something that happened in the past. And I was also thinking, as I said to Denise a little bit ago, that one way that I think we may think about these as we are particularly entering into this holiday season is with a very famous story that envisions not just once upon a time, but this is in many ways a Plexus carol to me. And you know, in the Dickens story, we see that Scrooge experiences not only what was, but also he gets to see what is in ways that he didn't understand before, with Tiny Tim and the Cratchit family and so on. And then he gets to see what might be, but not what necessarily will be, because that depends on what he and others will ultimately do. And so I was thinking as we were preparing this morning that in soliciting stories from all of you, these are in fact stories, and I hope they will be stories, about the Plexus that was and the Plexus that is and the Plexus that might yet be. And that's kind of what we're hoping to hear about from all of you. And as you know, these are being recorded. And so we've asked some folks to share today. I've got a couple other people who are supposed to be joining us who said they would share stories today. Hopefully they will find their way here during the course of this time together. But Madeline, I do believe that you had said you would be willing to kindly share a story with us. And I'm going to turn this now over to you and mute my microphone and tell us your story. And then maybe we can talk a little more about it.
Thank you, Bruce. Well, you asked me to write the story, so I have written it. And I'm going to read it, but I'll try to read it as if I were telling it extemporaneous. Now, as a principal in a consulting company, the work can be very lonely because not all projects require teams, and bouncing ideas, you know, with others can be limited. And even if you have a colleague who works well with you, you can't always share the full story in order to gain their insights. Even when a team is called for, the client may not be able to afford the senior staff you'd like to have in order to get those kind of insights that you want, those breakthroughs. In the end, there are times when you feel your thinking, while effective to achieve business success, needs to be sharpened. You want to be held to a higher level. You learn to live with this known challenge that faces every consultant. You read as many books as possible. You keep up with the literature as well as you can. You attend conferences and workshops. You talk to colleagues. Even then, you may not feel you're being brought to a higher level, a real higher level of seeing the world, of understanding the subtleties of human dynamics, or even global trends. When I was first invited to a Plexus meeting, I went because I had great faith in Lisa Kimball. When I got into conversation with others in Plexus, I knew I had found the intellectual environment I had been longing for. Members were from different industries, working at different levels, bringing different amounts of understanding of complexity, and holding me to a higher level of thinking and conversation. It was energizing. It pushed me to consider new ideas, and at the same time welcoming my own curiosity and exploration as sort of natural behavior when learning is part of your purpose. Now, I'm a member of the Plexus Institute, where intellectual conversation is equally challenging. In fact, I just finished a video teleconference with a group like this on Zoom on a wonderful topic, but it's never face-to-face. Well, it can be, but their conferences are very expensive. I was a founding member of Golden Fleece in Washington, D.C., where we looked at the use of story in organizations. It was where new ideas and learning were equally challenging, but it no longer exists. We lasted for 10 years, we accomplished our objective, and we disbanded. So it's really Plexus that has filled the bill and has become my place of intellectual stimulation.
So, Madeline, thank you for sharing that story. And for those just arriving, welcome Dan and Amanda. What we were saying just as we were getting going this morning is that, you'll see I made a quick little comment in the text chat box, is that, you know, sort of like I was thinking about the holiday story, A Christmas Carol, and how in many ways this is a Plexus Carol, stories of what was, what is, and what might yet be. And we hear that in Madeline's story. I knew about the Golden Fleece, and certainly, you know, I have my own history with Plexus. Madeline, how can you tell us a little more about how you think Plexus might, what would the organization of this look like that would now enable people to do more of these things together?
Well, if you notice in the story, the Plexus Institute gives me this kind of an environment, but only for me, only in this form, video. Now, I've done this for years. I've done it since the beginning of when it was available. So it's very comfortable for me. But there are times when you really want to, you know, rub shoulders with people. You really want to feel as well as see and hear. In the case of the Plexus Institute, their conferences are incredibly expensive now. And I mean, I appreciate the fact that they can appeal to an audience that can afford that, but it's just not on my radar. Golden Fleece, I used to run a conference. It was a great conference, if I say so myself. but we finished, and that was that. And so I am always looking for places where I can get together. So I'm hoping that Plexus will continue with their periodic conferences, obviously at a reasonable rate.
Thank you. I'm going to open this up for a little bit of brief discussion and Q&A as we have our storytellers share this morning or this afternoon. So I know I see that some of you, but I think everybody else except myself and Madeline have ourselves on mute. If you want to have a comment or a question about something in Madeline's story, please do unmute yourselves and feel free to, at this time, join in this conversation about that story.
And while we're waiting for somebody to open up, Bruce, this aspect of telling stories as a group is remarkably powerful. I mean, that's one of the things we discovered in Golden Fleece, that when you share personal stories, groups gel very quickly. So I'll stop.
Okay. Yeah, Barb, go ahead.
So I have a response to that. I found the Plexus fractal, and I felt like I had come home. I have 2 kids with special needs, and so I kind of disappeared into that whole morass for a very long time. And when I was beginning to come up for air, it seemed like the world had changed, and I didn't know where to begin again. And the generosity of the DC fractal and the openness and the willingness for anybody to come in, it was so exciting, and everybody was so smart, and the things that were being talked about were so intelligent. And so that's I agree, the face-to-face, and I'm thinking, Madeline, that maybe we should think about having another DC fractal.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just quickly add to that. Even after I wasn't living in Maryland anymore and was back in New Jersey, I used to make trips from New Jersey to DC just to go to those fractal sessions.
Mm-hmm.
Any other comments or questions for Madeline about that story? I saw something in the chat box, and I didn't notice who had typed that in. Let's see.
I think it might have been me.
Yeah. Go ahead, Denise.
Since it just doesn't sort of separate each time. But the question of whether, like the DC fractal, whether there's an opportunity for what I'll call localized face-to-face meetings, if it's every 6 months or it's twice a year. If there is not a significant number of people in a location like Little Connecticut, how would you feel if there were face-to-face and we had an ongoing on-the-screen projected Zoom, Zoom room, so that people could hear? And I do understand with breakouts that it gets a little wonky and that it's more difficult, but part of the fun thing that's happening is that we can connect here and see each other, although we can't rub shoulders globally. We can archive it, we can use it for that next stage. But I'm just not sure at this moment how we can try to draw the world in, but still have, that high touch point.
Right. The reality is you can't today. But, using blended technology, if you will, face-to-face along with a Zoom screen, I think that's highly effective.
Yeah. So we can experiment. I mean, I think that's something that might be worth experimenting.
I helped the World Bank actually introduce what they called their global distance learning system. And we literally had project officers for the first time work with people all around the world on their projects. So if they were working in Vilnius, you had the team in Vilnius on screen and the rest of the team were in Washington. And it took about this much time for it to take off. I mean, people saw immediately that there was value.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll follow up on that if I may. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just one more thing and then I'll mute myself. The opportunity to, even if it's a minuscule number of people in wherever you are, if you can bring them into the room together with you, then you could have, all these little screens would have 4 or 5 heads in them. And then you could do the breakout work. You could have the experience. You'd be touching shoulders with other people, and then you could all reconvene. You could reconvene back here virtually, which I think was somewhat like the World Bank model when you had, different offices in essence sort of collaborating together. But I'm going to mute myself now. So thank you. Thank you, Madeline.
Oh, you're welcome.
And Madeline, I was going to sort of follow up on both what Denise said and what you said, and whether we're meeting in face-to-face in real time in the same physical space or here as we're doing virtually online. Do you find that what motivates people to continue and to keep coming back, or I'll make it an open question instead of suggesting the answer, as I'm given to do. What do you think does motivate people to keep coming back, whether it's face-to-face or here in Zoom or anywhere else?
Well, I can only speak for myself, and it's the conversation. Yeah. It's the level of the conversation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, any other comments or questions on Madeline's story before we move to our next storyteller today?
It's John.
Yeah, go ahead, John. Yeah, please.
Thank you. One of the issues that I grapple with is that whether it's face-to-face meetings or virtual meetings, it's difficult to create a meeting that's not seen to be artificial. And in my own area, in the healthcare area, health professionals, with their very traditional formal meetings. One of the things that has really interested me over the years is that when you go and visit a doctor's lounge in a hospital, and you see clusters of people having coffee together, and they have arranged themselves because of the relationships that have been built there. And that's difficult to achieve in a formal setting. And the discussion starts with, gee, let me tell you what I did with a patient last night. And there's a structure around that discussion, which has all sorts of educational jargonese built into it, because somebody's going to say, well, whenever I do that, whenever I encounter this, I always do this instead of that. And of course, we call that positive deviance. We have this jargonese that keeps us away from the people that we really want to try and influence. It's some way in which we could produce a creative space that the group actually feels they own it. The major centerpiece is the building of a relationship over a period of time. And that's and when you read reports like the Aristotle Project in Google and places like that, you hear of the importance of the relationship building and the ownership of the space. Can you really achieve that in a conference? And I hate to use terms that we're coming away from a previous century, but how can you achieve that ownership and the relationship building that leads to creativity?
And John, I would reflect that back to you. In your experience, what are the kinds of things that tend to better enable those kinds of developing relationships and lasting energy?
I think when they're started by the participants, I noticed that in the new HBX system that Bharat Anand reports in his book, the most popular media is in fact their private face group. And that's because there's a feeling of ownership that educators have not been involved in, so to speak. So I think some way of the group initiating it and focusing on the relationship building. I spent my entire career in boards of various sorts. And you never get to know people on those boards because all you know about them is what they know in the literature. You never hear their inner voice because the relationship hasn't been built to allow that inner voice to come out. And that's where the emotion, the passion, and the creativity is needed for us to move forward.
Do you think that kind of following on what we've been talking about in terms of both in-person spaces and online spaces, do you believe that kind of relating and building together over time is possible in this kind of virtual environment?
I think over time, yeah. Yes, and it can be blended, and of course blending does help. But I think over time and a community facilitation that has some interest and knows a little bit about the research in relationship building.
Thank you. Anybody else with any comments or questions as we finish up with Madeline's story in this first segment?
Bruce, there's a comment I'd like to make back to John.
Yeah.
You're really touching, I think, a very important point. And there's been a lot of research and work done in the area of knowledge management called communities of practice, where they really talk about how you form them, how you maintain them, all of the aspects of ownership, all those things. So that might be a source for us.
Yes, it's in fact talking about your own practice as opposed to someone else's in a journal. Mm-hmm. I think that's really what needs to be talking about your own practice. Let me tell you about the patient I saw this morning, or as opposed to a case report, which is a sort of reified version of a patient's story.
Yeah. I want to hop in. I do most of my consulting and coaching in healthcare, and spent yesterday at 2 major medical centers in New York City. And I love what John's talking about. The hierarchy sometimes stands in the way of people opening up to one another. I dare not say what I've done or what I think because someone else is going to push me down or out. And I think that the trust issue is a tremendous portion of what we're dealing with, is creating a safe space. And it does, whether we do it online or face to face, people have got to feel that there is something good that's going to come out of this, and I'm not going to be placed in a position where I've been made to feel foolish or been marginalized in any way.
I entirely agree. I think that's, and one of the issues we have in healthcare is that we haven't invested in the worker's experience as much as industry has. When you look at what's happened in Xerox and Toyota and Cisco, other areas like that, where continuous improvement has in fact been absolutely essential, or else they go out of business.
I have to share this with you. I was with a physician, obviously not going to tell you his name or position, but very unusual man. He has dual specialties, and one of them, he studied psychiatry and did not go into that field, went into a second specialty. And in the conversation I had with him yesterday, he was telling me how he has been a big proponent of lean for healthcare before anybody else knew about it. And it came about because his next door neighbor had been Jack Welch. And this was in the early 90s. When Deming's work was first coming to the attention of anybody, it was all in industry. And so Welch kept on telling him, you've got to do this, and insisted that he go to Crotonville and go through all the certifications. And he says the best thing that ever happened to him. But that level of openness, I think, is representative of what we have seen in Plexus, that willingness to say, it doesn't matter what I've known before or what I thought worked, that I'm willing to roll up my sleeves and try something and look at life through a new lens. And it's completely changed this physician's practice.
Yes, no, I entirely agree. One of the things that I think about from time to time is to explain to people why an environment is complex as opposed to complicated or simple. And I always come back to the Cynefin model, which I think people really understand, because then they understand the importance of the story, and to use the story to identify the patterns. I think that this is totally new to medical and healthcare education.
Well, on that note, and for the interest of time, and again, as Denise said earlier, respecting everyone's time, I want to move on. I think we had a couple other volunteers today to tell us stories. And if memory serves, I think Dan and Amanda, you had both said you'd be willing to share a little bit today. Anybody, I'm going to open it to you. Do either of you have a preference as to who would like to talk next? I'm not seeing any hands raising and shooting up quite yet, which will put me in the position of having to call on, just like a teacher. So
I'll go.
Without revisiting school trauma,
I'll start. So my story with Plexus goes back, I think, to 2003 or 2002. It was shortly after I had read the appendix to Paul Plissek's. Paul Plissek wrote an appendix in Crossing the Quality Chasm. And in that, he said, if there was any hope for a redesigned 21st century healthcare system, it rested in our understanding and application of complex adaptive systems theory to the healthcare system. So I was a nurse educator at the time, and I was clueless. I didn't know anything about complex adaptive systems. And I thought, if I'm educating the next generation, and this is the only hope for a 21st century redesigned healthcare system, I better get some knowledge about it. So I called Kurt Lindbergh at the Plexus Institute, and I said, I'm trying to plan a sabbatical, and I would like to come and learn with you what complexity is and how you're using it in healthcare, how you're using it in nursing. And he said, oh, don't wait for the sabbatical, just come on down now, he said. We're having a conference, I think then it was about applications of complexity to nursing. And there was a conference in New Jersey, so I went. And then shortly after that, he said, well, would you consider being on the board of trustees? And I said, oh, okay. So not knowing what that involved. And so I did that, and I did that for a long time and got to know Henry and Keith and Lisa and Prussia and a variety of folks. And I think I did that 2005, 2010, maybe for 7 years. I was on the, and I saw a lot of peaks and valleys in terms of activity in the Plexus Institute. And the thing that I love about Plexus is that it's my go-to place for knowledge about complexity. And so I call it my knowledge network. And I love the fact that they were curating information about complexity. And I particularly loved the Plexus calls. And I participated and led a lot of those Plexus calls. And I still use those Plexus calls. I embed them in my course. I refer students to them. And so it's the curation of the knowledge and the content that is valuable to me as an educator in terms of the work that I continue to do. And then I think the underlying key really was the sustainability of Plexus. And, you know, for the longest time, I think Henry was one of the major financial forces of keeping Plexus afloat. And when we couldn't get traction in terms of financial stability, that's then when people began to think, oh, well, maybe there's other ways. And I think in some respects, things weren't moving fast enough for Henry in terms of the uptake of some of the complexity ideas. And that's then, I think, when he went off with Keith and started the liberating structures stuff. So Plexus went through a real slump there for a while, and we thought about actually closing it down way back when. And so I agreed to serve as the chairman of the trustees for a 1-year period to kind of recalibrate it. And that's when we were working with Jeff Cohn to come on board and kind of take over as president of the Plexus Institute and try to get some more sustainable models in there. And so my year came and went, and Jeff sort of took off, and I think that's then when they had some of the grant work with the Gates Foundation, and they went from healthcare and the Mercer Project to the education world. And then I think it just continued to sort of weaken. And so I was really excited to see Plexus 2.0 and these pop-up things, because I really value my time in Plexus and still do, and you know, do the calls with Prussia whenever I can. But I think one of the things that's important in terms of this community of practice and digital communities is making an ask of people in terms of what their contribution is going to be to the organization, and what knowledge do they have, what skill do they bring, how do they use complexity in their day-to-day practice, and what can be learned from that, and how we can begin to collect resources that might be available to the rest of the Plexus community. So I'm trying to start here in Minnesota a nursing foresight initiative, and have been looking at a lot of what the World Future Society has recently done. They sort of went under, and now they're kind of coming back, and have studied some of the work of Etienne Wagner in his notion about digital habitats and networks of people contributing, and looking at some of the research about the evidence for building online communities. And I think that there is a lot there that can be learned in terms of the future. But I don't know that the future is so much face-to-face anymore. I do think the future is more this digital habitat where people can kind of zoom in and zoom out. And it's about curation of content, creating content, and sharing of content. So that's my story.
And Dan, a quick question, and I'm going to open it up to everybody too. But in terms of the curating and the content, and I really like your point about the ask. What kinds of things do you think people can and might do under this, what I'll call broad umbrella of Plexus 2.0? What kinds of things do you think are possible in these kinds of communities?
Well, for one example, I think it would be really interesting if people put together storyboards in terms of like liberating structures. You know, you would have a conference and put together a storyboard of what liberating structures you might use or how you might use complexity. I think the recent publication that Plexus did about unexpected gifts is a great product that was curated over time, and maybe asking people to use that and giving them feedback about that, and maybe expand that and write little vignettes about how that was useful or not useful, how to evaluate that. I think ongoing Plexus calls where people would contribute an idea about how they use. It's sort of like this, but maybe in a Plexus call, more one-on-one and not maybe so one-to-many. And then an index where people might be able to go and say, oh, I need to use complexity principles in a financial institution or a healthcare institution or a physician practice or a community center. Some of those sorts of things I think would be really useful and helpful.
Thank you. And I'll now open this up, as we did before with Madeline's story, for questions, comments, input from everybody else. Just remember that right now everybody else is muted except for Dan. And so please unmute yourself. Madeline has unmuted herself. Madeline, do you have a comment or question for us?
I do. I really like the emphasis that you placed, Dan, on curation. That is one of the real innovations that has occurred through the internet. Totally unexpected and unanticipated. And yet it's incredibly effective today, where you know somebody is a good curator. You just go and you look at their stuff, and you don't have to do your own searching, at least not initially.
Right.
I think that aspect of curating things and then allowing to have a good index, so there's some good findability when you go after this sort of thing. And I don't disagree with you that the virtual world is certainly the predominant one today. I just like to be with people.
Thanks, Madeline. You know, I'll just mention something, and some of you may know this particular Plexus past story and project, some of you may not. And it gets to me to this notion of curation and virtual space and technology and how these things happen. Some of you may know that, I don't know, I couldn't tell you exactly how many years ago now, but Plexus had worked on a very unique contract project with the Department of Health and Human Services about the future of electronic health records. Are any of you familiar with any of that? I'm not seeing heads going this way. So I'll just say that what had happened was that D. Hawk, the guy that wrote The Birth of the Chaotic Age, had somehow knew the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and they were talking about this. And D. Hawk suggested something that, to my knowledge, I've never in over 30 years of government service seen this done. He convinced the secretary to issue 3 contracts simultaneously for the same work. I mean, today that would be on like the scandal page 6 of the Washington Post if the government was, you know, engaging in this kind of quote unquote wasteful spending. 2 of the 3 contractors or consultants were traditional, Deloitte or whoever, I forget who they were. The 3rd was Plexus. I know Sharon Benjamin worked on this, and I think Kurt and Lisa. And what they did, and they had a very short period of time to talk about what this should be. And they used an online sort of wiki-like platform. And within weeks, the amount of content and information that was put into this curated content, was astonishing, what came up and came out of this. And since it was kind of a self-organizing wiki type of a system that they had picked, and again, I'm forgetting the name of the technology platform, but the results were spectacular. And when all 3 consultants had to go and make their final presentations to the senior staff at HHS, the Plexus presentation was simply not like anything else. It was quite a remarkable story in that way. And so again, this notion of the power of curating, the power of the technology platform to do this kind of stuff. Anybody else have other comments and questions in regards to the story? Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm hearing curation, and I have to tell you, I immediately thought of Pinterest, because a lot of us over the years have figured out that we are constantly finding things and bookmarking them in places that we can't find. So as we talk about ways to be able to do things, I think we have to remember the visual is so important. The fact that we are very often capturing a symbol or a photograph or some kind of a graphic. Amanda's all excited. Okay.
Yeah, I'm liking that. That's great.
Yeah. I don't want to see another wall of words, even though I was a big wiki user, blog poster and everything in the day. I think right now we understand if we can visualize something, if we can see patterns of things because of pictures and graphics, I think it's going to really capture people's imagination and engage them.
Amanda, do you want, Denise, I think, has her hand up. Go ahead.
But I really liked, Dan, what you were saying, because last week I had a conversation with a gentleman, Eton Rich, who could not join us today, and he's in Germany, and he sort of COMPlexus and is hopefully going to be participating and adding some really interesting new concept. He does work primarily in the European Union. But one of the things that emerged out of the conversation was this concept of, and I said, people at Plexus are different. I said, we're different kinds of consultants. We're a different kind of professional class. And he said, stop. And I said, okay. And he said, that's really exactly what we are. We aren't saying that we're a particular kind of professional. We are a different kind of professional class. And Plexus can be, and going back to what Henri, has so strongly believed, that we need to be able to have clients, and we need to be able to have products, and we need to be able to have services, so that all of us can do the things we like with the people we want to be doing them with. We still need to pay the bills. And so Plexus has an opportunity, potentially, to be the platform for this new kind of professional class, so that you do give. So there is definitely a value for value. Your contributions are with time and energy and projects and products, and coming into a thing, every Monday morning, someone comes in and goes, I've been working on this particular project, and here are the things that I'm working on, and I need help on blank. Here's what the contract is, here's what the work is going to be, and I know that I'm going to do a blow-away project that's going to be infinitely better, like what happened with the Health and Human Services Department, if we come together. And that is something that doesn't happen in the consulting consortiums when people are coming from a wide and diverse background. Quiet. So yeah, thank you. Let's do this.
And so, Denise, have you seen any examples where people have been able to self-organize projects like that in that kind of a way in this kind of environment? Any success stories?
I do have 2 stories, and actually they're very personal. I mean, they're, looking to a network of people that I've worked with. I'm an independent consultant, and being able to come together and actually say, look, I have the potential to do this project, or I've been asked to do this project. Here's my area expertise, and my other area expertise, I know I won't be able to be effective with everything else that's on my plate. And from my perspective, what happens is clear articulation of what the give and the get is. And so, Plexus would have to be really clear and transparent on, here's what the project is, here's the contribution, here's what you're being paid. And it has to be fair, because people are going to be making those sort of specific choices based on how do they spend, 30 hours a week. And that's different than coming together and sharing and trying to learn and build new skills and, sort of hold yourself accountable, Madeline, and, reach for the stars and say, hey, I know a little bit about this, but I really want to be able to have an adequate conversation. So I think it has to do with trust, number one. It has to do, going back to you, John, to be able to say, I have been in conversation with everybody in this room, which I have, and I would feel very comfortable. Dan, less so, because this is the first time that we've actually talked, but I know a lot about you from everybody else, including Frank, who is our biggest cheerleader. But I would be comfortable picking up the phone and calling any of you and having that kind of conversation. So maybe this is the beginning, and maybe the framing of it as, you know, this being a platform for this new professional class may be indeed a way that we can create something that is pretty distinct and different, and still work within the, you know, work within the guidelines and the mission and the values of what Plexus is. So that's a very long story. Sorry, Bruce.
No, not at all.
I will give you more specific and share more specifics about exactly what that was with the group if you'd like.
Thank you. And I see that Brooke has joined us. Welcome. And where we were at right now is in, we've been sharing some stories, and we've heard stories so far from Madeline and from Dan. And I think we've got another storyteller who's waiting very patiently, Amanda, to talk to us as well. So Brooke, welcome. Oh, I heard something somewhere.
I'll just share two other little follow-ups. Recently, I joined a group called the Professional Futurists Association, PFA, and they have a network of people with profiles that do much of what Denise was just talking about. There's a Google listserv, and they put out questions, and they get responses from each other. They share resources. They kind of look at issues. They ask where the best current trend information is in that regard. So that might be a model. And the other one is the World Federation of Future Societies. It also has a listserv, and they have an interesting website that's curated where they've put together a list of all of the courses on futures around the world at different universities in different countries. And they are they also had another group that they were trying to build called Unlocking Foresight. But now Unlocking Foresight is now going to be shifted to the platform called futurethink.com. And that is, I think, a consulting firm about futures thing that has done a lot of curation about futures methods, futures research, futures thinking, futures strategies, and that sort of thing. So I think that things are out there. So.
Excellent, thank you. And I saw a comment go by, I think it was from Loretta, about Taylor. Yeah, for those of you who are not familiar with Matt and Gail Taylor's stuff, I would sort of second that. Really interesting work, both verbally and visually, if you're not familiar with it.
Exactly. I mean, I just kind of fell into MG Taylor in the fall of 1997, which was just around the time that there was a feature article in Fast Company about them. I hadn't seen the article. That's
where I saw it.
Well, I wound up in Hilton Head and just walked into the site not knowing what they were, what they were, and wound up quitting my job 6 weeks later and joining them because I was so enamored of what they were doing. They had about 6 paid staff and about 200 associates who were not on payroll. And each one was sponsored by somebody else who was in the team. So just like we're saying here, we understand one another and we speak well of one another and we understand what it means to be part of something. And, so we know who'll fit in. And they were, gave everybody a chance to be able to do a gig without being compensated, to be able to prove that they had the mettle to be able to partner with them. And they had unique methods. You can find the old MG Taylor website stuff archived with outrageous amounts of content because Matt Taylor is fabulous at archiving everything. But I think what was most important was that this was so respectful of people and their skills. We understand that you've got the personality. We were talking about a professional class. They were a professional class, without doubt. But when you join them, they said, what would you like to do? And there were like a dozen different roles you could do within a consulting gig, and there were 20 consultants on a gig. So there was a couple of people doing certain things, but everybody pitched in on almost everything. if you became skilled at something and wanted to continue doing it, you could, but they would encourage you to try your hand at other kinds of things. So, there were people who were doing graphical facilitation. There were people who were doing music arranging for the background of the events we would run. We would write activities. We would publish the results of a gig. It was absolutely amazing. But it was always, who wants to do the next gig? Here's who our client is. It's in this industry. This is the name of the company. This is the issue they're going to be working on. You have from now until such a date, maybe a week later, to be able to say you'd like to come forward. And they created their own technology for us to be able to send something in. It was probably something akin to a wiki, but we didn't know what that was because it was it was more than 20 years ago. But you would get an email from the guy who was the crew, KREW, everything was a K because of knowledge, that you were part of the group. And once that took on, when you got to the site on the day that you were about to begin, that was when you really established who was going to do what. It was fabulous. And even today, even though they are no longer functioning in the same fashion, the firm had some financial problems, we still maintain relationships with many of the people who are there, and you would recognize the names. I mean, some of you might know Kelvy Bird and the work that she's doing with you. Yeah, I see heads going. Kelvy was one of the first people I got to know there. I mean, it was just absolutely amazing work. So there's principles that you can borrow from these things and say, okay, as Denise is saying, people need to be allowed to step forward, to be able to contribute. And it shouldn't be, I have to ask you, it should be all voluntary, because then the spirit is, it's ours together. It doesn't belong to one person, it belongs to everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you, Loretta. I'm so glad I picked up on, saw that M.G. Taylor reference go by. I'll mention too, they had remarkable pioneering work in rethinking physical space for gatherings. And they had a handful of physical stores around the country, which they called Nowhere or No Here stores with a capital O. And one of my big regrets is that I didn't find out about them and that they had a store 15 minutes from my house until it was already closed. But such is life. In Princeton, they had one. So thank you for filling us in more. And again, the M.G. Taylor stuff, like you said, the archive online is a very remarkable deep dive that you can take if you got some time and interest. I think we had one more storyteller who had volunteered today. Amanda, do you still have the time and the interest to share with us? And you're muted right now, so you'd have to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Or you can simply, do it in pantomime.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Awesome. Cool. Thanks. Hi, it's good to see you all again. It's been a minute, so I'm appreciative. I went ahead and, well, first sort of share, I love the sentiment that things are sort of turning digital, and I sort of would also love to agree with Madeline in that there's no replacement for getting together in person too. And so I very much am a proponent of both for a bunch of reasons, and one being that visuals are easier to share and draw together. And so in sharing my story, I went ahead and drew a couple of things. And so, which I'm just going to hold here, so forgive me for the movement. But I first found Plexus via a call from Lisa Kimball, as many people do, and she talked me into it. And it was literally like walking through a door to a bunch of people in a space where I felt like people get this. People understand what it is to actually connect to each other. And I have spent a bunch of time in Outward Bound and teaching leadership skills to students, to teams, to all kinds of people from all backgrounds and lives. And we do that in the woods. And we do that by creating a team atmosphere and a space that, is safe, where there is this ownership we've been talking about for all, and a whole bunch, everybody has a role they're into, maybe some more than others on some days, but here we go. So to walk into this space of sort of what was my first conference, where people were using liberating structures, were using the space for connection in different ways than I had previously seen was really powerful to me to say, hey, wow, I can take that stuff I do in the woods and I can do it here. And there are other people out there already doing it. And so for me, that was a huge and awesome thing. And sort of then what has come from there has just been tons of connections and relationships. And, we use the word connections all the time. And my other half is always, I also use the word energy a lot, right? Like, oh, there was really great energy. And he's always pushing me like, what in the world do you mean about energy? Like, you just use these words. That could mean 17 different things. There's, energy that goes with the tech world. There's energy in this world. And so I've been working really hard to not use these really broad words like connections and sort of start to really define what it is that I'm attempting to talk about. In some places I'm fumbling well. But what has come out of sort of these connections have been really incredible relationships with people who I met at the first Plexus conference I went to. I still have regular conversations with a whole bunch of people. Anytime we're in each other's space, we go out of our way to see each other in person whenever possible. And I've just really, really appreciated those as well, and then there's some people too that I probably met my first time in the back of my head that I'm going to reach out to and I haven't yet. Sometimes it takes me a minute or years, a Baltimore minute, right? Any period of time. And then also sort of popping into and creating other things that have come up. And so like Yes in Philly, which I sort of co-host with Bruce and Kathy Reynolds, which is our sort of change space, came out of meeting them through essentially Plexus. And so to me, Plexus has been the ultimate catalyst, and I'm really excited for whatever in the world is next. And I'm excited that I have no idea what it is. And I'm also very excited and appreciative that this is a crew and a group in which we do and are able to bring those things that we're each really excited about and good at and want to do together. And so I think that's super important. And I'm just really excited to be here and appreciate visuals with you all. And I like words too, P.S. Sometimes. So that's one version of my story.
So Amanda, quick question. I'm going to open it up too. I really liked what you said about, how when Lisa contacted you and you held up the drawing about sort of going through the door and finding this family or network of people, this community that I think you said, they get it and you felt connected to that. What is the stuff? What is the stuff that is the thing that you felt they had and you had, and that made you feel like you could or would be part of that?
Oh man, that's a great question, Bruce. And I think it's one that I maybe have been trying to answer for many years, but it's in some ways, I think it's hard. It's partially hard because it's not a word answer, right? Like if we were all in the same space, I would have us all actually pause for a second and take a deep breath together, right? And so that sort of connection, there we go again with that word, that sort of connection, but it's also, I think, this idea that so often we go to conferences and it's like, oh, I'm here to learn. I'm here for that intellect. I'm here to get that specific knowledge or that thing or talk to that person. Where with these kind of things, it feels like it's that sort of intellectual piece, but there's also this acknowledgement to our humanness. There's some acknowledgement to not only our humanness, but the systems and the outer environment in which we sit and are and be. And every time I move in this way and I'm trying to talk to you guys and you guys can't see, right? There's so many things that affect. And so I think there's that acknowledgement to all those variables needing to work together and this sort of interconnectedness of things. Because it's not just about connecting like A to B. It's, you all know this already. Yeah, so. That's my.
No, and I appreciate, these calls, as you know, are being recorded, and so other people who aren't joining us today, they're going to hear, your great answer to that, and I appreciate that, and I really like what you said about, it's that shared thing. It isn't just the typical conference thing of you've got this piece of knowledge in your head and you're going to give it to me, and then it's going to be in my head. It reminded me of when I first met Ralph Stacey. and his notion that knowledge doesn't exist in us, it exists between us.
Mm-hmm.
That it's relational
Space
and
in
dynamic.
between.
Yeah,
White
and it's
space.
relational and dynamic in that way. So I'm going to open this up as we have for our other storytellers today. Anybody else have a question or a comment for Amanda? Madeline,
Amanda,
you got to unmute yourself.
Amanda, I just loved your words. I loved your energy. And I'm so glad we got to the young voice in this crowd. And I really value how you articulated moving beyond the intellectual to the humanness. I think that's really great language. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else, any other questions or comments at this time for Amanda on this? I know for myself, working with Amanda and knowing, I see that energy every time we get together and walk into that Yes and Philly space. It's the possibility coming coming to life. It's just a great thing to experience again and again and again when we do this together. So not hearing or seeing any other comments, and what you all have made it real easy for me to facilitate the timeline on this. We are exactly at the 1 hour mark. And I want to thank everybody. And Denise, I'm going to turn it back over to you to give us some concluding Plexus wisdom and comments, if you would. But you got to unmute yourself.
I will unmute myself, and I will also share. This is what I do. I have thousands and thousands of these pages, and I always sort of guide my reflections based on what I've been writing down. Sometimes there's pictures. I don't know if I have any here that I can share, but it's a way to bring that energy and what's here into a space so that I can then create those connections. And I have started drawing more pictures, and I occasionally share them with Amanda and Barb. But I think, thank you. But I think what's really cool, and what I'm holding right now is, okay, this is so fabulous. I'm so appreciative of everybody's time, and I'm anxious. And I guess I'm going to say that, and it's going to go out in the recording, because I don't want to lose the opportunity and the potential that we have. And I personally need everybody to say, okay, here's what I'm doing. Here's what I think could potentially happen. Here's the energy that I'm bringing. And Amanda has been a really good coach on that, of me asking. And also the guidance to say, step up, where can we go with this? And we have another pop-up coming up on Friday with Mark Narcus Kramer, who's really anxious to write a book about his experiences in the MITRE Corporation and do exactly what Dan said. Where are those experts in complexity that have models or experiences that could be applied to more traditional, process improvement, NGO, governmental experiences? Really cool, really daunting, and really cool. And I think that over the course of the next month, we will indeed see some projects and hopefully some products emerging in ways that can be shared on a larger basis. And if you have clients who might be interested in talking to anybody or just sharing and hearing about what we have, I think there's a group that we could pull together at any time. Barb, Loretta, here's a way to think about bringing people in, and Barb has done that, to say, hey, let's have a conversation. And if you're interested, we can throw together a proposal with a number of really cool people who are thinking about these same kind of problems and projects, and they're going to come up with a solution, or at least a way to a solution that's going to make you think differently. So that's my pitch. Bruce, thank you. This is the first. I know there's going to be more because there's an infinite number of stories, and I'm really appreciative for everybody here. And see you on Friday if you're available. Otherwise, you'll have the recording. And I am going to be in Washington next week. So I hope that for those who are in DC, if there's an opportunity to get together, I'd really like to do so. Okay, thank you. I'm going to stop the recording. Okay.
Thanks, everybody. Great. Really appreciate it.